Tonight, we're going to be talking about guns. Honestly, to me, this is the most frustrating debate because people rely too heavily on their emotions and how they feel rather than the actual facts. It makes sense why people are so emotional because who is not devastated and saddened when they hear about 17 school children being massacred? Everyone feels some kind of way about that. And I genuinely believe that everyone in this country wants to find a way to prevent these tragedies from happening. But people are getting too caught up in their emotions and are just constantly bickering at each other, calling each other names about one side, those who are on the side of gun control. These people typically talk about, if you don't support gun control, the blood of these children, they're on your hands. If you do not support gun control, then you are just as responsible as the crazed lunatic who committed that horrific action. You and the evil NRA are responsible for these shootings because you're not doing anything. And we're the ones that care about children's lives. And then, don't get me wrong, on the other side, it's what are the phrases that you hear often on the other side? Shall not be infringed, referring to the Second Amendment. Over my cold dead hands, are you going to take my gun? Like, you're going to have to kill me. You're going to have to kill me, shoot me dead before you confiscate my guns from me. So people are emotionally invested in this issue. But the thing is, the issue at hand is children being killed. It's ultimately violent crime and homicide. That's what we should be focused on here. Not guns. Because there's no correlation at all between gun ownership and violent crime, homicide. There is zero correlation whatsoever. So this entire issue is being hijacked to be about something that has nothing to do with it at all. Now, I know what people are thinking. Guns are being used to kill people. So it's a completely reasonable and fair thing to talk about guns. And on the surface, that sounds like a completely reasonable and logical thing to say. The problem is, it has no basis in reality. And I'm going to prove that to you in this video. Why gun control, or just the conversation about guns in general, does not solve the actual problem here. The actual problem is that people are being killed in this country at a much higher rate than any other industrialized country on the planet. And nobody seems interested in actually solving the problem, meaning the politicians. Because let's be honest, the politicians do not give a shit about your dead school children. Because if they did, then they would have a problem bombing innocent school children overseas. But they have no problem with that. They have no problem with that whatsoever. So when you see a politician, whether they're Democrat or Republican, it makes no difference. They're all frauds. Look at their foreign policy record. If they talk about how they're saddened and heartbroken and devastated like President Obama did after the Sandy Hook shooting with his little crocodile tears, look at his foreign policy record. Look at all the innocent children that have been killed under his watch, under his authorization. So, don't be fooled by the spectacle of everything. Don't be fooled. Don't let your emotions get the better of you. And throughout this video, we're going to talk about the facts because facts matter. We have a crisis in this country, and nobody is offering any real solution to the problem. But that's what we're going to do in this video. First, we're going to talk about guns. And that's going to take up a good portion of this video because we have to talk about it because that's what people are talking about. And we're gonna prove that it has no reason, there's no reason why guns should even be talked about in this issue, because there's no correlation whatsoever between guns and violent crime. But after we're done with that, we're going to propose actual solutions, actual ways to solve this problem. Not gun control, or even getting rid of all gun control and arming all teachers, and making sure everyone has a weapon, and increasing access to firearms. None of those two proposals will actually do anything to solve the underlying problem or even make a dent. And we're going to prove that right now. When we're talking about mass shootings and gun violence, the underlying problem, of course, is that people are being killed, right? So it would be helpful to see the most dangerous cities in the country, to see if there is an actual correlation between gun laws or lack thereof and actual murder and homicide. Because that is ultimately the concern, is that people are being killed. So here are the 6 most dangerous cities by homicide rate, and we have something pretty interesting here. So I highlighted cities in red and blue. The blue cities being cities with the strictest gun laws in the country. The red cities being in states with very loose gun laws. And you can see right here that there doesn't appear to be any correlation between gun laws and violent crime and homicide. Let's take a look at the 6 most dangerous cities. And this is where both sides of the so-called gun debate engage in deception. What is the most dangerous city in the entire country by homicide rate? That would be St. Louis, Missouri, with a homicide rate of 65 per 100,000. So think about that for a second. You always see on Fox News and pro-gun right-wing news outlets that the underlying problem with cities like Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, which have all made the list, don't get me wrong, they are dangerous cities. That is certainly true. But to frame the issue as gun control being the problem, the underlying problem, and if you get rid of gun control in these states, then the problems in these cities are just going to go away. Needless to say, that's misleading and that's completely inaccurate and doesn't do a damn thing at actually helping the people of Chicago, of Detroit, of Baltimore. And this proves that. Because if there was a clear correlation between gun control and a greater amount of homicides, then you would think Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit should completely dominate this list. That it should really all be blue cities. But it's not. The most dangerous city is St. Louis. Yet you don't hear about St. Louis on Fox News. Why is that? Because they're promoting an agenda of guns, guns, guns. Guns are just the greatest invention made by man. And we need more guns. And that will solve all of our social ills, as if we just give everyone a gun. And all of our problems will magically go away. The issue is, it's not that simple. And on the other hand, if you're on the gun control side, sure, yeah, the most dangerous city in the country is a city that is in a state, Missouri, with the loosest gun laws in the country. But at number 2, we have Baltimore, Maryland. And number 3, we have New Orleans. But then below that, we have Detroit. It's pretty much neck and neck with New Orleans. But then we have Memphis, Tennessee, and then we have Chicago. So yeah, Chicago is not the most dangerous city in the country, but it's up there. And to say that gun control is the solution doesn't seem to be any basis in reality. I mean, just look at the numbers right here. Look at it. This shows that there is a much bigger problem here that there isn't necessarily a correlation between access to guns and people being killed. So we need to dig a little bit deeper, don't we? And let's do that. So people on the side of gun control often take a look at other countries, that we should look at what they did. Namely Australia. That's the big example they use, of Australia being definitive proof that gun control works. And if we adopt gun control, we adopt what the Australians did, then all of our problems will go away. Well, let's take a look at Australia. So here's Australia. This is 25 years of data relating to the homicide rate in Australia per 100,000. So let's see if their 1996 gun control law actually led to a noticeable drop in homicides in Australia. And in case you don't know what I'm talking about, in 1996 there was a mass shooting, the deadliest mass shooting in Australian history. 35 people dead in Port Arthur. And in response, the government enacted a comprehensive and wide-ranging gun control legislation, which went everywhere from magazine sizes to certain types of weapons being banned, semi-automatic weapons, assault-style weapons, whatever you may call them, were banned. And it was made a lot harder to obtain certain types of firearms that were still legal. So it was a very comprehensive gun control law, and within 6 months, over 700,000 firearms were turned in, and the rate of gun ownership in Australia went down significantly because the people of Australia felt that they did not need to have guns, and the people of Australia felt that giving up their guns and turning in their guns was a way to solve the problem of mass shootings, to prevent one from ever happening again. Now that's an important point that we're going to touch upon later when we talk about the United States, because, well, we'll talk about that later, but I'm sure you know where I'm getting at with that point. But let's take an actual look at the actual rate of homicide in Australia. It looks like from 1989 it was going on a downward trend. I mean, from 1989 to from about 1993 and 1994, it was kind of fluctuating up and down a little bit, but it was definitively on a path of going down from 1994 to 1995. I mean, it dropped fairly sharply over here, and it was on that downward trend. It stayed fairly stagnant throughout 1995, 1996, 1997, 1998, and then it actually goes up 2 years after people turned in their guns, 2 years after the most comprehensive gun control legislation was passed in Australia, and the rate of gun ownership went down significantly within that 2-year span. The actual homicide rate was able to go up a little bit, and was higher than the point that it was in 1994 before the shooting even happened, before this gun control law was even passed. So then you go down further to 1999, 2000, and it goes down a little bit, and then it shoots up again. It's just as high as it was in 1993, 3 years before that gun control law was even passed. And 5 years after, the actual homicide rate goes up. And yeah, it starts to go down in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, and then it goes up again. The point I'm trying to say is you cannot definitively say that the gun control law in Australia, that there was a direct correlation between that law being passed and a massive drop in homicide. It's not there. But this really transitions into a bigger point here. Let's say, for argument's sake, that the gun control law in Australia actually did work and you actually did see actual results. If it did work, it only worked because the people in Australia let it work. Okay? There were over 700,000 firearms turned in to the Australian government. The majority of them, of course, being the weapons that were specifically banned, but also a lot of those weapons were also guns that weren't even banned under that new gun control law. People just willingly giving up their firearms and turning them into the government, because there was a consensus among Australians that these types of weapons and just guns in general were dangerous. They didn't need to be, there wasn't a need to own them, and they were willingly able to give them up. That was the consensus in Australia following the Port Arthur shooting. There may have been some people who resisted it, but generally speaking, a significant majority of Australian people agreed with the gun control measure and were willing to give up their firearms. Same thing with New Zealand in the wake of the Christchurch shooting. People in droves were turning in their firearms even before they had any legislation put forward banning those certain types of guns. People were just giving up their guns to destroy them, for the government to destroy them. Okay. Knowing all that, these gun control policies, these gun control measures, if they were successful, were only successful because the people made it a success. Compare Australian and New Zealand gun culture to American gun culture, where there are more guns in the United States than people. There are about 393 million firearms in the United States, only 1 million of which are actually registered firearms. It's going to be incredibly difficult for the government to actually track down all those weapons that are in circulation. So it would require mass participation, voluntary participation among the populace to make such a gun control policy effective. And most of the bans that you see, even in the most progressive states, don't apply retroactively. So there was an assault weapons ban in New York, but if you owned one before that ban was put in place, you were still allowed to have it. It was still viewed as legitimately owned. And that just speaks to U.S. gun culture, that even in the most progressive anti-gun states in the entire country, for the most part, these gun bans that they have do not apply retroactively. That if you purchased the gun before the ban was put into effect, they weren't going to do anything to you. It would require a massive voluntary action on behalf of the American people if such a piece of legislation was passed nationwide that banned certain types of weapons specifically, and had a gun confiscation thing to it, where that you were specifically, it was a federal crime not to have it, similar to in Australia where it was a felony. If such a law was applied, and we haven't really seen a law like that passed ever in the United States on a massive scale, it would not work in America, because again, US gun culture is far different than Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United Kingdom, other countries that might not necessarily have the problems that we have in regards to mass shootings and everything. And you may say, well, that might have something to do with guns. But at the same time, even if that assertion were true, you would have to completely change U.S. culture for the laws to actually work. Okay? And I'm sure some people I have some viewers from New Zealand and Australia and Canada and the United Kingdom that may be scratching their head a little bit about Americans and why they're so obsessed with their guns. Well, there are a couple of factors. Probably the most noteworthy one being that yes, the United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand all have that one thing all have two things in common. We all speak English, and we are all former British colonies. But one thing that sets the United States apart from the rest of those countries is that the United States did not gain their independence peacefully. It was through a violent armed revolution against the British government, which they viewed as tyrannical and oppressive. It was ordinary citizens taking up arms against the British government, against the most powerful military in the entire world. The story of ordinary people able to fight back and win against all odds because the citizens were armed and took up arms against an oppressive government. That is pretty much the heart of the Second Amendment, which is another thing, which we will talk about extensively later on, about the constitutional aspect of gun control. And that being another reason why gun control, even if hypothetically it worked in other countries, even though we don't really see a correlation, we don't really see it. But let's say if we did see it, let's say if it was objectively true that gun control works in every other country. The fact that gun culture is American culture makes it incredibly difficult for an extensive, from a truly effective gun control policy, like the one in Australia, that banned specific types of firearms. For it to actually work in the United States would require massive amounts of voluntary participation, and I can't see that ever happening in the United States. You would have to completely change American culture, where what set the United States apart culturally from Europe was its affection for firearms. As sad as that may sound to some of my international viewers, that's just a fact. And it may be a troubling or unsettling fact for many people living in different countries, or even people in the United States who feel very strongly for gun control. It's still something that needs to be factored in, that the overall culture, the gun culture in the United States is so different, and people may attribute that as being a cause of these mass shootings and of homicide and of all that. But we will expand upon all that later on. But it is something to say that even if these laws were effective in other countries, to make a direct comparison between the United States and countries like Australia, although, again, we both speak the same language, we are similar culturally, we're part of the West, it's still not a fair and accurate comparison. Which leads me to this. Laws meant to change already existing societal behavior, all of those laws fail if the people are not willing to change their behavior. Laws are meant to improve people's lives at the end of the day. Of course, it doesn't always work out that way, but that's what the supposed intention is really meant to be, right? When it comes to banning certain types of firearms, when it comes to banning assault weapons, when it comes to banning certain magazine sizes or whatever, at the end of the day, what appears to be the motivation would be to save people's lives, is to improve society. But the problem is, if people in society are unwilling to actually change their behavior, the effects of those laws end up being devastating. Case in point, the prohibition of alcohol. In 1919, the United States Congress ratified the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. And the 18th Amendment pretty much instated a ban on alcoholic beverages and all alcohol-related products in the United States. It was a total, complete ban. Now, was prohibition effective? I'm sure most people already know the answer to this, but I want to provide some interesting insight to just how truly ineffective prohibition was and how it actually made society worse. One of those things being that there was we'll talk about it. Let's go chart to chart, okay? So we have the per capita consumption of alcoholic beverages. And these were all gathered from a report by the Cato Institute about the failure of prohibition. And it's a very interesting report that I suggest you all read. It's a very interesting part of United States history and just demonstrates how ineffective prohibition is. But for the context of this video, this is really it just adds flavor to my whole argument. Okay, look at this per capita consumption of alcohol. Okay, in 1919 that's when prohibition was enacted. And yeah, from 1919 to 1921, you saw a sharp decrease in alcoholic consumption. But then it shot back up in 1922, 23, 24, 25. It pretty much reached the same levels as it was before prohibition was even enacted. And it was actually going on a downward trend before prohibition was enacted. It was going on that downward trend, but then prohibition all of a sudden comes along and it goes up and up and up and up and up and pretty much reaches the same level as it was before. And what is the point to all this? What does this have to do with guns? I'm sure a lot of people are asking right now. Well, it just proves the point that laws alone cannot change already existing behavior in society. I mean, look at the consumption of alcohol. It did not have the effect that it was intended to have, to reduce alcoholic consumption, because the rate of consumption, it went up. It actually went up after prohibition was enacted over time. So then let's look at the second point. Is the whole point of transforming people who were following the law, who were perfectly law-abiding citizens, transforming them into criminals. Look at the rate of incarceration just in a year alone. From 1919 to 1920, it's shot up. It shot up. So there was mass incarceration. There was a higher rate of incarceration in the United States after prohibition was enacted, because although it was illegal, societal behaviors didn't actually change. Which leads me to my final point about prohibition, is that it also has an even more drastic, more negative effect on society. And that is actually, even though you designate a certain thing to be a crime, and your whole point of doing so is to stop that type of behavior and make the country safer, because alcohol does have a lot of negative effects, and we are going to expand upon that, because that goes into an interesting point about the entire gun debate, but we'll talk about that in due time. But if your intention is to improve lives, is to make society a better place, first of all, you're putting more people in jail. I don't think that qualifies as making society better off, putting more people in jail. Where prisons were so overcrowded, people, like, the prisons didn't know what to do at that point. What about the rise of organized crime? Okay, and that's another thing that prohibition leads to. And you could even look at the war on drugs. And the reason why I'm not specifically talking about the war on drugs in this video is because I'm saving that for next video. Because that's the topic I want to talk about next, because it's another very interesting topic. But the war on drugs is the same thing. It doesn't really have any real effect on drug use. People are still doing drugs. The incarceration rate is just astronomical, and we're going to touch upon that actually in this video. But we're going to expand upon that even more next video when it comes to the war on drugs and just general prohibition empowering organized crime and actually leading to an increase in crime. Look at the rate in 1919. Just look. It goes down. I mean, it's the homicide rate. It's pretty much fluctuating, but it's relatively, it's going up. But then look at how much it skyrockets throughout the 1920s. It reaches an all-time high in 1932, the year before Prohibition was repealed. And then as soon as Prohibition is repealed in 1933, homicide rate goes down. All of a sudden, the main revenue stream for the mob, for organized crime, is obliterated, essentially, because now it's legal. People would rather go to the bar and to legally obtain these items than to have to go underground. But that's what happened. The alcohol market didn't just go away. It went underground. So let's say the United States goes out and bans guns. Okay, whether it be certain types of guns, all guns, it really makes no difference in this case. Because if the demand is still high, the supply goes down, that doesn't have any negative effect on demand. People are not going to stop demanding it. They're going to go to other places. Case in point, Chicago, Illinois. People who support gun control policies will mention Chicago, saying that, oh no, gun control is not the problem. It's the loose gun laws in the neighboring states that leads to the high rates of murder and just how much gun homicide happens in Chicago. But that kind of proves the entire point that I'm trying to make, doesn't it? Because it's all about supply and demand. Laws alone do not have an effect on that. It really, all you're doing is creating more criminals at that point. Look at Canada, for example. Canada is a country that people talk about that doesn't have mass shootings going on all the time, that doesn't have the problem that the United States has, like Australia, like New Zealand. Canada also borders plenty of states that have loose gun laws, yet the demand for guns in Canada, needless to say, is very low. So yeah, people in Chicago and other places where there are strict gun laws do obtain their firearms from places with loose gun laws. But just think about that for a second. If people truly want something, they're going to get it one way or the other. You look at Mexico. You look at how the guns, because they have drug cartels over there that use weapons to smuggle billions upon billions of dollars of illegal substances and everything, that they use those firearms to enforce everything, right? To make sure that everything is, to make sure that they maintain power. And people on the side of gun control may say, well, because there is no gun control in the United States, we are contributing to the rise of the drug cartels in Mexico. Yet, again, in Mexico, there are pretty strict gun laws over there. They have some of the strictest gun laws in the entire world. It's incredibly difficult to obtain a firearm legally in Mexico. Yet the drug cartels found a place, the United States, where firearms are much easier to obtain. Similar to how, although there was massive drug prohibition that's still going on in the United States, people still found a way to get drugs, and they got those drugs from Mexico. So it emphasizes my whole point that if society does not change on its own, laws alone are not going to change people's behavior. So prohibition, and that's exactly what gun control advocates are proposing. They are proposing a prohibition on certain types of weapons. They keep talking about Australia, countries that actually had a mandatory gun confiscation, but those gun confiscations were only effective because the people were willing to go through with it and agreed with that legislation. Considering how polarizing guns are in the United States, the effectiveness of such policies, as we said earlier, is definitely in question. And just the laws of supply and demand dictate that if people are truly determined to get a certain type of product, no matter what that may be, whether we're talking about guns, drugs, alcohol, they're going to get it one way or the other. You look at the numbers, you're more than twice as likely to die of an alcohol-related incident, whether that be liver disease, whether that be getting hit by a drunk driver and killed, or anything else related to alcohol. You are far more likely, you are more than twice as likely to die of an alcohol-related incident than you are to be a victim of any type of gun violence. Never mind mass shootings, which only account for a small minority of actual gun violence. And the mass shootings is the thing that we're focusing on here in our national discussion every time there's a shooting, right? Well, look at these two numbers. One is significantly bigger than the other, and then here's the kicker. That number, 33,000, includes 20,000 people who die every year of suicide. Now, you may say that there is a correlation between gun control and lowering suicide. So if we enact gun control, we will also fight suicide. And this is just repeats the underlying problem with the gun control philosophy, because that's what it is. It's an idea that has no basis on reality. It's just filled with hypotheticals and emotional provocations. That's all the gun control people on the side of gun control have. It's think of the children. Think of the children. Think of all these children that are being killed. Look at all these people being killed in shootings. You know, but they don't look at the they don't even look beyond what you see on the news, the sensationalized media, because they talk much more about gun violence, and not even most types of gun violence, which, you know, have a lot. You have armed robberies, right? You have people being murdered in cold blood in their homes, and you have just people being killed, going on much more than these mass shootings you hear about. But you hear very little about alcohol. So if your underlying reasoning for supporting more gun control is that you want to preserve as much life as possible, you are sick of seeing all these people dying, and you want to do something to save people's lives, then, and your solution to saving people's lives is to confiscate certain types of weapons, to ban certain types of weapons that are causing harm, or really, handguns cause the most, so you should go after those more than these assault type rifles. But if that is your overall motivation for supporting gun control, then you should be calling Congress to reinstate the 18th Amendment, because alcohol claims far more lives. When you take away suicide, because these are people killing themselves, right? And they're going to find another way to kill. The whole notion that suicide has anything to do with the access of guns, when we have countries like Japan that have far fewer guns and have a significantly higher suicide rate than the United States, and other modern countries that do have higher suicide rates than the United States, yet have a significantly higher suicide rate, even though they have far less access to firearms, as you would say. No one's talking about alcohol. Nobody. And we've already said that prohibition does not work. So this isn't me going on a whole pro-prohibition rant. But if you are on the side of gun control and wish to be morally and logically consistent, then you should care a lot more about the number 88,000 than 33,000. And when you take away the 20,000 people that kill themselves, and I guess there are a lot of people who kill themselves with alcohol abuse, but the difference is the alcohol abuse is exacerbating that, right? First of all, if you kill yourself with alcohol, you are drinking yourself to death, essentially. I guess that would be a form of suicide, of killing yourself, but that really is more of an addiction problem than you have other reasons why you want to kill yourself and shoot yourself or whatever. When it comes to gun violence, 20,000 suicides. So far more people are committing suicide than there are homicides when it comes to gun violence in this country. And so when you compare that, that's 13,000 compared to 88,000. So that means if you look at those two numbers, you are 650% more likely to die of an alcohol-related death than you are being gunned down in the street. Whether it's getting hit by a drunk driver, because it isn't always people abusing themselves. These are people who, while they're under the influence, are killing other people in these car wrecks, or either killing other people in a different car or on the road, pedestrians or other passengers in the car. This is where I really have a huge problem, because we already demonstrate that prohibition of alcohol doesn't work, which results in far much death, which has far more negative effects to society than firearms. Do I need to say anything else here? I think we're pretty much beating on a dead horse, but it just amazes me that the amount, the mental gymnastics that the people on the gun control side are using. Right? It just boggles my mind. Which brings me into my greater point, that the issue of gun violence in this country is a somewhat manufactured crisis, a word that a lot of people have loved to use lately when it comes to immigration and certain other issues, that it is a manufactured crisis. Well, how about the gun debate? How about gun violence? A lot of people die of gun violence, but when you actually look at the context of those deaths, of the majority of them being suicides, and when you look at the context of alcohol deaths, where people are still being murdered, people are being murdered by alcohol, where alcohol is the cause. So if your whole underlying logic is, well, alcohol is something that you can moderate, or it's not something that is inherently used to kill, as opposed to a gun. Again, this goes with an underlying misunderstanding and just lack of knowledge about guns in the first place. Which leads me to this greater point here. People fear what they do not understand, and those advocating for gun control show a clear misunderstanding of firearms and a lack of knowledge. The best example of this is the entire conversation surrounding assault weapons. It's a term that I've used extensively throughout this video, but what actually is an assault weapon? Before we talk about the effectiveness of an assault weapons ban and what that would mean and everything about that, we need to determine what an assault weapon actually is before we do any of that. And the problem is that there is no clear and definitive definition of what an assault weapon is, what constitutes an assault weapon. Because there's actually a difference between an assault weapon and an assault rifle. That already makes the conversation confusing as hell, because the AR-15 is clearly a rifle, but it's not an assault rifle. It's an assault weapon. And what is an assault rifle, first of all? And then we'll try to figure out what an assault weapon actually is. Well, an assault rifle are weapons of war. They are weapons that are used in combat by infantry, and they either have fully automatic, they either fire fully automatically, like machine guns, and that means you pull the trigger and you can fire every round that's in the magazine, essentially, as long as your hand is still on the trigger. As long as your finger is still on the trigger, you can fire as many rounds that are left in the magazine, as opposed to semi-automatic, which are weapons where you have to fire, you have to pull the trigger each time that you want to shoot a round out. That's the difference between fully automatic and semi-automatic. So fully automatic weapons are included in assault rifle, and they're also weapons that have burst mode. So if you fire, let's say the pull of one trigger fires more than one round with the pull of one trigger, but not technically fully automatic. So we're talking about burst fire. So you think of the Vietnam War when they used burst fire for the M16. That's to ensure that the target would be neutralized, that you would shoot a number of bullets, but it would also be efficient because you wouldn't just be spraying bullets all over the place when it comes to fully automatic, because you're just firing a whole bunch of bullets. But with burst, it's more tactical. So those are the two things that constitute an assault rifle. But the AR-15, you notice, doesn't follow under any of those two subcategories of what an assault rifle actually is. So there's a difference between an assault rifle and an assault weapon. So then, what is an assault weapon? Well, that's a good question. So we're gonna read the definition by the Department of Justice. I figure that this is the best definition we're going to get, because we're talking about government regulation here, right? So we're going to see what the government actually defines as an assault weapon. So the Justice Department defines assault weapons as semi-automatic firearms with a large magazine of ammunition that were designed and configured for rapid fire and combat use. So there are a few problems with that definition. First of all, it's confusing as hell, because assault weapons, they're semi-automatic firearms with a large magazine of ammunition. Okay, so that is clearly what the AR-15 is. I mean, it obviously is a semi-automatic firearm with a large magazine of ammunition. But the AR-15 is also not an assault rifle, because, as we already said, an assault rifle would be weapons that are fully automatic or have burst fire. And the AR-15 is semi-automatic. Now, here's the thing about semi-automatic. The whole thing about semi-automatic weapons being dangerous, being inherently dangerous compared to other types of weapons. Well, let me let you in on a secret. Pistols, shotguns, most rifles, they're all, the majority of them are semi-automatic. So the pistols that you see that police officers use, and standard pistols, handguns that are actually deemed unconstitutional to actually ban after DC versus Heller was decided. Remember, Chicago and Washington, D.C. instated a handgun ban. The Supreme Court struck it down. So most of these handguns are actually semi-automatic. The only exception being, maybe a few revolvers, maybe certain types of pistols that are like really powerful and aren't really semi-automatic. But the majority of guns are actually semi-automatic. So this whole conversation, it's misleading, and it's fear-mongering, because we're talking about a ban on semi-automatic weapons. Well, you'd be banning most weapons. Maybe that's the actual intention here. But the AR-15 is not a weapon of war. So going back to the second half of the definition here, that semi-automatic firearms with a large magazine of ammunition that were designed and configured for rapid fire and combat use. Well, the AR-15, is it really designed and configured for rapid fire and combat use, when the AR-15 was never used in a battlefield. The AR-15 is not a weapon of war. These assault weapons that you hear about were actually designed for civilian use. They don't have a fully automatic feature to them. They don't have a burst fire feature to them. They are not weapons of war. The military has never used the AR-15 in a battlefield ever. The M16, which is similar to the AR-15, and was actually based off of the original AR-15, because the original AR-15 was designed for military use. That is true. But what people misunderstand is that the M16 was built after the AR-15, but the AR-15 specifically that is manufactured by Colt, the types of weapons that you see in these mass shootings, they were designed specifically for civilian use, and they would be very ineffective in a battlefield. So we got that over with. And already we have some serious problems when it comes to the actual definition. It's still very ambiguous on what an assault weapon actually is, because that whole definition is that the Justice Department put out is not very clear and can apply to a wide variety of weapons that aren't even part of this greater conversation about gun violence. It can include many types of different weapons, including handguns and rifles and even shotguns. So it's... Oh, and as for the large magazine, because people are going to mention that the AR-15 can carry a large amount of magazine, you could really modify many weapons that aren't even considered assault weapons to carry large magazines. But it's also a myth that weapons that carry large magazines are inherently dangerous and need to be confiscated or banned or whatever you may have, and that getting rid of these weapons actually leads to a real decrease in firearm deaths. So let's talk about the assault weapons ban of 1994 and how the assault weapons ban of 94 is proof that this conversation around assault weapons is just meaningless. It means absolutely nothing. So, yeah, the term assault weapon did not even exist prior to this legislation, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which included as a provision of that law a ban on what the government defines as assault weapons. But that term didn't even exist prior to this legislation being introduced. So let's talk about the assault weapons ban of 94 and whether or not it was actually effective. There is not a single study that shows a clear link between the assault weapons ban of 94 and a decrease in firearm deaths. There just isn't. Actually, the assault weapons ban of 94 had no effect at all on firearm deaths throughout the mid-90s. There was no noticeable decrease. So people talking about how we need an assault weapons ban when it's already proven through the assault weapons ban of 94 that it does absolutely nothing. And then in 2004, when that ban expired, we didn't see any increase in homicides. Actually, the rate of homicide continued to decline rapidly even after the assault weapons ban expired. So if the whole narrative that we're pushing is that these weapons are dangerous, inherently dangerous, and should not be accessed by ordinary people because they carry a large amount of bullets in them, so the AR-15 typically carries up to 30, and they're so-called weapons of war. Well, this law that banned those specific types of weapons, it had no effect on the amount of firearm deaths. It had no effect on the homicide rate. And there is not a single study that actually links the assault weapons ban to any positive effects. It was just meaningless and ineffective, and it did absolutely nothing. and the context of assault rifles, it's and the context of weapons. See, I already confused assault rifle and assault weapon. They're two completely different things, and I unintentionally confused those two things myself. And that's just the entire problem with this whole conversation, is that the definition isn't clear, and even when you have a clear definition of what it is, which is already ambiguous, it could really apply to anything. But let's say you have it narrowed down what an assault weapon actually is. Never mind assault weapons or assault rifles or whatever. Rifles, all rifles, whether it be these assault weapons, these so-called weapons of war, or even simple hunting rifles, all rifles only account for roughly 5% of all gun-related deaths. An overwhelming majority of gun deaths are handguns. So this whole conversation surrounding rifles and weapons of war, assault weapons, really, even if there was something to what they were saying about these weapons being dangerous, I mean, you look at the actual numbers, and even if you took out all these weapons, even if you were able to get all these weapons out of circulation, which is incredibly difficult, because even the assault weapons ban of 94, if you purchased these weapons before the ban, they would not confiscate it from you, as we were talking about earlier. So these rifles only account for 5% of all gun deaths, so they contribute very little to gun violence, and what contributes mostly to gun violence is suicide, which you already established there's no link between suicide and ownership of firearms. So then when we talk about all rifles, knives result in 5 times more deaths than rifles every year. 5 times more deaths. Yet, we're barely talking about knives. That knives are not this deadly menace to society. We're focusing on these assault weapons. So I have 3 items. In case you're wondering what these 3 things represented, well, these things are less scary and more accepted by society than these so-called weapons of war that are dangerous and scary. But all these 3 things kill more people every year than these dangerous weapons. Or it's just, we already talked about alcohol, about how far more people die of alcohol than of any firearm, never mind assault weapons. When we're talking about these assault weapons, far more people die with knives than assault weapons. And then we have a burger, which represents heart disease, which is the leading cause of death, of preventable death in the United States. Yet we're far more concerned about these scary-looking guns than about obesity. I mean, we have a fat acceptance movement in this country. What does that say about how truly concerned we are about obesity in this country? Not very much. So, yeah, people fear what they do not understand, and people who advocate for gun control, when they talk about these so-called assault weapons, clearly demonstrate that they have absolutely no working knowledge about guns. So when we're talking about alcohol, when we're talking about food, about unhealthy lifestyles, well, you would argue, well, yeah, more people die of alcohol, more people die of heart disease, but that's ultimately up to your personal responsibility, and you can choose to be responsible. But when it comes to firearms, you have bystanders who get killed. Well, we already established that in the case of alcohol, there are innocent bystanders that get killed. Far more people die of drunk driving incidents than these mass shootings. Okay, let's make that very clear. But again, we're not calling for prohibition. Nobody is. Because most people recognize that it's ineffective and it's unreasonable when there's so much alcohol consumption in society, to just ban it. It won't work. But there's a significant number of people in this country that have never even fired a gun before, and just look at what they hear on the news and on the media and determine that guns are scary. But that irrational fear and misunderstanding of guns, as well intended as it may be, you're trying to save lives, it actually kills more people than it saves. Which brings me to gun-free zones. Gun-free zones are locations in which all people are prohibited from carrying firearms. So it's schools, it's malls, it's public locations where guns are prohibited either by federal law, or if it's a private location, the people who own that store will ban guns from being used. So here's the thing. The vast majority of mass shootings occur in gun-free zones. There's a clear motivation that mass shooters have to target these specific areas to maximize damage. You've heard a lot about the El Paso shooting and about how the shooter was motivated by white supremacy, which is something that's very scary and troubling. But here's a quote that you didn't see from the same manifesto. And let me read it to you. It is not cowardly to pick low-hanging fruit. Don't attack heavily guarded areas to fulfill your super soldier Call of Duty fantasy. Attack low security targets. Even though you might outgun a security guard or policeman, they likely beat you in armor, training, and numbers. So the El Paso shooter was motivated by white supremacy, but he was also motivated to maximize damage by doing the shooting in an area where guns were specifically prohibited so people couldn't fire back. It says it right here. You think it's a coincidence that this was not mentioned? Because it doesn't fit their gun control narrative. You've never even seen this quote before. Most of you watching this have probably never even seen this. And the reason you didn't see that quote, it does not fit the narrative of the entire premise of gun control being that high accessibility to guns and easy accessibility is what's causing these deadly mass shootings. But when you take a deep dive into gun-free zones, realizing that gun-free zones are areas, public areas in which your access to firearms is pretty much non-existent. You cannot have a gun in these areas. If you want to go to a school, if you want to go to university, if you want to walk into a movie theater, or if you want to go to a concert, whatever it may be, you can't bring your gun with you. Because guns are scary. Because guns kill people. And there's no need for you to have a gun in a place of learning, in a concert, in these other public places, because guns just their only purpose is to kill people. Well, sure, those people are going to follow the law. They're going to leave their guns at home. But the fact of the matter is, and we showed that the El Paso shooter had a clear motivation as to why he targeted that specific mall, that specific area, because he knew that there would be little to no armed resistance, because the citizens' access to firearms to defend themselves is gone in these areas. So when you talk about, 4 out of 10 of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history occurred in the state of Texas, but the state of Texas, it doesn't matter what state you're in. If you're in a red state, blue state, every state in the country has gun-free zones, and every single deadly mass shooting in Texas happened in a gun-free zone. So stop saying that access to guns, that easy access to guns is the problem, when the gun-free zone pretty much allows, it empowers evil people to maximize damage and kill as many people as possible, because there would be no armed resistance at all. So I don't want to hear that easy access to guns is the problem, and we need to restrict people's constitutional rights, because it's intellectually dishonest and has no basis in reality, because that's the common denominator here when it comes to these deadliest mass shootings. Not the type of weapon being used. Virginia Tech, 3rd deadliest shooting, 33 people killed. Handguns. Those were the only weapons being used. Handguns. And we already talked about assault weapons and that whole why that whole discussion is stupid on its own. But the overall logic behind gun control being that we need to restrict people's access to firearms, and that's going to solve all our problems when people are following the law and they're being killed for it. So if we're actually interested in either preventing these mass shootings or significantly reducing the amount of deaths, then we should consider abolishing gun-free zones. Because gun-free zones are killing way more people than the lax gun laws are. Because again, gun-free zones, that is gun control. You are literally controlling access to firearms for everybody. And it's dumb policy. It makes absolutely no sense. And it's just based off of people's emotions and how they feel. People want to feel safe, but they don't actually want to be safe. They just want to feel like they're safe. And we really need to consider abolishing the gun-free zone. It would significantly reduce the deaths. I mean, all of the really deadly shootings in the double digits, the vast majority of them occurred in gun-free zones. And you may have a different definition of what a mass shooting is, but the FBI considers a mass shooting to be 4 more people, and not including drug-related gang violence, or when we're talking about people being killed in their home or shot in their home. So you may want to include those variables and try to reduce the number, but at the end of the day, if you want to be factual here, that is what a mass shooting is defined as, and we already know what a gun-free zone is. 94% of mass shootings occur in gun-free zones. So where's the logic and the sense here in establishing these gun-free zones when it objectively is causing more damage than it is causing good? So while I stand by my original point that there is no link between gun laws and homicide, because at the end of the day, mass shootings only account for 1% of all homicides. So even if we address the mass shooting problem, we're still not addressing the greater problem here. And we're going to talk about that later. But I just don't understand how people think that limiting people's rights, their constitutional rights, is the solution when the facts and the evidence point towards the other direction. Let's finally talk about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment. There seems to be a huge misunderstanding about the Second Amendment and the overall Bill of Rights and what it actually means and what it represents. There's a reason why I saved it for last, though, because I didn't want my entire argument to focus around a single document, a single piece of paper. Even though that piece of paper represents so much more, I really wanted to focus on the facts and the reality of the situation in regards to gun violence and regards to the entire gun debate as to why gun control advocates are just simply factually wrong. Never mind the Bill of Rights, never mind the Constitution, but it simply does not work. Okay, so we talked about that, and we were able to prove that throughout this video. But the Bill of Rights and the Constitution is also very important. What is the Bill of Rights? And what is the purpose of it? Well, during the early stages of our country, we had what was called the Articles of Confederation, which essentially, there was essentially no federal government to speak of. They were not able to collect taxes, and they didn't really have much power. So there was really no central government to speak of. And even though there technically was a central government, it really didn't have too much power and authority. And it pretty much felt more like 13 independent countries. It was literally a confederation of independent states that just formed a coalition rather than being one united country. So the people quickly realized that the Articles of Confederation needed to go away because it was not a sustainable system to have a functioning government. So we adopted a new constitution, and that constitution included a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are rights listed that imposes clear limits on the government. These are rights that the government cannot violate or limit. So That's essentially the purpose of the Bill of Rights, to set clear limits on government power and authority. And it shows rights that the citizens clearly have that cannot be violated. So the First Amendment is something that we can all identify with here. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right of the people to peacefully assemble. That is something that everybody can identify with. But it seems that people just can't understand the quote-unquote need to have a gun, as opposed to the need to be able to speak freely, the need to practice your religion freely. And I never understood that whole ideological framework of freedom being anywhere associated with need. That freedom is measured by what we need. Like, where else is that concept applied? When it comes to the First Amendment, do we need to really have free religious expression? Do we really need to allow everybody to freely express themselves? Do we really need a free press? Do we really need to have people protesting and causing distress publicly? I mean, look at Hong Kong. They're protesting. I mean, do we really need to have these protesters all over the place when they're just obstructing people's everyday lives? I mean, they're blocking airports. They're doing all these things. Do we really need to have these protests? You know what I'm saying? Like, when it comes to if you apply that logic to any other amendment of the Constitution, it just makes no sense whatsoever. So why do we just apply that to the Second Amendment? Why do you need to have a gun? Do you need to have this assault-style weapon, the so-called weapon of war? You don't need to have this weapon. Do you need to have 100-round magazines? Do you need to have this? Do you need to have that? We only apply that logic when it comes to the Second Amendment, not the other 9 amendments in the Bill of Rights. And it just plays into my greater argument that I made earlier, that people generally have a fundamental misunderstanding about firearms. I mean, they view firearms as just weapons of war, killing machines. But as we said earlier, there are plenty of things that we don't consider to be as nearly as dangerous, but are actually statistically cause more deaths, like alcohol, for example. So there just seems to be an irrational fear and an overall misunderstanding when it comes to firearms. And that essentially is the heart as to why the Second Amendment is under such attack compared to the First Amendment, compared to all the other amendments of the Bill of Rights. So let's actually read the Second Amendment and go over what it actually means, because that also is where a lot of the misunderstanding comes in. People just don't understand what the Second Amendment actually means. So those who are in favor of gun control will mention these 4 words: a well-regulated militia. And those who are against gun control will focus on these 4 words at the end: shall not be infringed. But let's go over what the Second Amendment actually means. So let's read it out. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So what does it mean? And it may seem a little confusing because the word regulate actually had a different meaning than it does now. When you think of the word regulate now, you think of government regulation, right? You think of the government regulating drugs, food, or certain types of industries where there are clear government regulations, and you have government agencies that make sure that these corporations are following federal regulations. So you have food inspectors, you have drug inspectors, and you have all these different types of government workers that enforce these government regulations. But the word regulate back in 1791 had a completely different meaning than it does now. Back in 1791, the word regulate simply meant organized. So a well-organized militia. And of course, a militia was an army of the people. It was the people taking up arms. Ordinary citizens with no military training whatsoever, able to take up arms against a tyrannical government, as we said earlier. Being necessary to the security of a free state. So that's talking about defending the sovereignty of the United States, either through defending from foreign invaders that try to come in, like we did in 1812, when the British invaded the United States, or, well, before the Revolution, the British government was our own government, right? That was the United States government before there was a United States. So it also includes your own government if your own government is tyrannical. And that's clearly what the Founding Fathers were going for. So in Federalist Paper number 46, which focuses on the relationship between federal and state governments, James Madison talked about how having state governments is a good counteraction to ambition, especially the 10th Amendment, which talks about any power that is not specifically granted to the federal government by the Constitution is given to the states or the people. So Federalist Paper number 46, James Madison is essentially talking about how having state governments as well as a federal government is the best way to counteract ambition and to keep government small, to stop it from growing and to potentially become tyrannical. But what did he say in the beginning? He said, besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. And then he talks about the benefits of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed. So we're talking about the role of the state governments as opposed to the federal government, and how that is a good way to counteract against ambition. It's more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit of, because there was really no government of that type back then. Most governments around the time of the United States' founding, they were unitary governments. So James Madison was making the main argument in Federalist number 46 that federalism is a great way to make sure that the government does not become tyrannical. But he says that in addition to having an armed society in which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. So when people mention that, there's no concept of the Second Amendment in any other country, that this is just something that people make up, and it just makes no sense. Well, this is exactly what the Founding Fathers were going for here, is to have an armed society to prevent the government from becoming too ambitious. So the whole concept of having an armed society to prevent the government from becoming tyrannical is not a made-up concept. It comes from the Founding Fathers themselves. So that is the overall context of the Second Amendment. It's the ultimate safeguard against a tyrannical government, whether it's a foreign government that's invading your country, or if it's your own government. Because, again, the British government was our government at some point, and we took up arms against them, and we were able to earn our freedom. So that's the context surrounding the Second Amendment. You need the Second Amendment in order to protect the First, because you could have all these institutions, you could have federalism, you can have separation of powers, checks and balances, but ultimately those institutions don't mean anything. They could easily be eroded. I mean, look at this entire conversation that we're having about whether or not we should have common sense gun regulations, whether or not we should have hate speech laws, whether or not, if it's okay for government to be able to collect so-called metadata on you and listen in on your phone calls and read your emails without you being suspected of anything. Just allow the government to read without a warrant to infringe on your Fourth Amendment rights. We're having this conversation about whether or not do you need a cop to have a warrant if you have nothing to hide? Do you really need to say things that are outlandish and just offend other people? You don't need to say offensive things, and you don't need these certain types of weapons. Again, the whole equating freedom with need is just, it makes absolutely no sense. And then there's that argument that you hear commonly about the First Amendment. If you shout fire in a crowded movie theater, then that's a common sense regulation on free speech. But that argument makes no sense in relation to the Second Amendment, because you are not specifically banned. The government does not specifically ban you from shouting fire in a crowded movie theater. It's how you deliver that speech. If there is an actual fire, then the government isn't oppressing you. If you're shouting fire when there is no actual fire, then yeah, the government that you can be prosecuted because you are causing a clear and present danger to society by causing a commotion and putting people in danger when you're causing public fear and by shouting fire in a crowded movie theater and having everybody go crazy and just causing a commotion and possibly getting people hurt for no reason. That is based off of your individual action. But when it comes to gun control legislation, it's gun control punishes everybody, not just people who are breaking the law, but people who follow the law, by banning certain types of weapons, by banning certain types of magazine sizes, by having ridiculously long background checks, by having red flag laws that don't even have any due process whatsoever, which is not only a violation of the Second Amendment, but is a violation of the 14th Amendment, is potentially a violation of the Fifth Amendment. So, yeah, the red flag laws are just a violation of like 3 amendments. So, the red flag laws especially are unconstitutional. But really, any gun law is unconstitutional. When you think of, when you read it, it's in plain English. The right of the people to own, store, and carry firearms shall not be limited. Well, gun control is a limitation on people's rights, is it not? So, people who support gun control, no matter what form of gun control it is, clearly do not have any regard for the Constitution, for the Bill of Rights, and don't think it's important. They think it's perfectly fine for people's constitutional rights to be violated. So, if you support gun control, and you want to be logically consistent, you can't complain if the government makes attempts to regulate speech, if government makes attempts to crack down on freedom of religion, and to deprive people of life, liberty, and property, when, without due process, when you support red flag laws. And ultimately, any gun law is unconstitutional. Any gun law. No matter what type of law it is. Any law that imposes limitations on people's constitutional rights is a clear and direct violation of the Bill of Rights. And this has been going on. This has been going on for a while. This isn't the beginning of the conversation. The National Firearms Act of 1934, which regulated sawed-off shotguns and regulated the so-called machine guns. The Gun Control Act of 1968, creating a gun registry, and also certain laws in certain states where you have to have a permit to have certain types of weapons. You have to have a permit. That's a clear violation of the Second Amendment. Needing a permit. It says the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be limited. Do you need a free speech permit? Do you need a permit to practice your own religion? So why would you need a permit to keep and carry weapons? And carry, that's another thing. Any country, any state in the country that prohibits carrying and requires a permit for you to carry is also a clear and direct violation of the Bill of Rights. I know what some people may be saying. Well, why does it matter? Guns are scary, and we need to do something about guns. So even if you are violating rights, well, these rights are antiquated. These rights are antiquated, so we should just get rid of them, because it causes more harm than good. Well, you ever heard that argument that I'd rather have dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery? But it's the truth. Freedom can sometimes be dangerous. But you can't say that you believe in freedom and you think that people have rights and freedoms when you're also advocating for policies that restrict people's rights and clearly violate the Constitution. So if we actually go through with this, and I don't know what direction this country's headed in, but if we go through with regulating guns, with continuously eroding people's constitutional rights, because we've gone far enough, too far. We need to repeal every single gun law if we actually care about the Bill of Rights, if we care about the Constitution. If we don't, then that's an entirely separate conversation. But the fact of the matter is, when authoritarian regimes take over, the very first thing they do is confiscate people's guns. The Soviet Union did it. Nazi Germany did it for Jewish citizens. who were stripped of their citizenship rights and also were not able to defend themselves. That was the main motivation behind disarming Jewish people in Germany, so that you can easily round them up and put them into concentration camps. And also, what about the first comprehensive gun control law that ever happened in the United States? It actually happened around the time of Reconstruction as part of the Black Codes in the South. Black people in the South were prohibited from owning firearms. You know why? Because what did people do in the South during Reconstruction? After slavery was abolished, and these people were guaranteed, where African Americans were guaranteed citizenship rights, the very first thing that they did was confiscate their gun rights, so that they were able to retaliate and make sure that those rights were not given to African Americans. So that included burning down African Americans' homes, businesses, places of worship, and also lynching African Americans, engaging in hate crime, killing innocent black people. So ultimately, if you support gun control, you support the government's ability to violate your constitutional rights. And if you allow the government to take away any one right, whether it's the Second Amendment or any other right that you just believe to be antiquated and non-important, it's too much of a slippery slope. It expands government ambition and authority, and that piece of paper that guarantees all the rights that you enjoy every day, at the end of the day, will mean absolutely nothing if you allow the government to violate any one of those rights. So that includes any gun control law, that includes any so-called hate speech law, any law that regulates people's rights, because the Constitution clearly says that those rights cannot be infringed by the state, by the government. So that is something that also needs to be said. And that also includes state laws. California requiring you to have a permit, and other states having strict gun control laws. The state governments should not have the right to do that. The Constitution clearly guarantees the people the right to keep and bear arms, and no state should violate those rights whatsoever. So that is the direction that we need to head towards, and it's just incredible how people are just so ignorant when it comes to your rights, that people just take them for granted. Like, it's just the piece of paper is ironclad, and it guarantees that you have these rights, that you have freedom of speech, that you have all of the rights that you enjoy every day. But when you allow the government willingly to take those rights away, because you have so many gun control advocates, when you allow the government that authority, then anything goes. Then that piece of paper will mean absolutely nothing. Again, a piece of paper on its own does not guarantee a damn thing, because we've had plenty of laws passed that clearly violate the Constitution. Even back in the day, what did we have? We had the Red Scare, where anyone accused of being a communist was locked up for just expressing any viewpoint that the government did not agree with. So this has been going on for years. Your rights have been eroded slowly over time. It's exactly what they're doing in Hong Kong, where they're not waiting until 2048 to get rid of the democratic system in Hong Kong. They want to slowly erode your rights over time, so that by the end of it, it won't be as much as a struggle for the government to violate your rights. Because if they just take away all your rights instantly, right away, you're going to notice it and people are going to retaliate. But if you take away their rights slowly and over time, you're going to eventually create a situation where the people are just willingly participating in their own oppression. So that it's not within your interest to allow the government to violate what's supposed to be your inalienable rights. And overall, gun control is not only ineffective, but it's dangerous. It's more dangerous than having an armed society. It's more dangerous not only because it doesn't work, because of the gun-free zones that we talked about, but also because you're allowing a situation for the government to take away rights that are supposed to be guaranteed. And ultimately, what I want people to take away from this entire discussion is that no piece of paper can guarantee your rights completely, because there have been laws that have been passed over years that have clearly violated those rights, whether it's for African Americans or other minority groups, like the Japanese internment situation back in World War II, or even more subtle things like you can't have certain magazine sizes. There's certain types of weapons that you just can't have; they're too dangerous. And there's certain types of things like you have the right to express yourself freely, but there's certain things that you really shouldn't say because they're offensive and they're hurtful. Again, this is all based off of emotion. It's creating an emotional climate where people fear freedom, and they're afraid of being free, and that being free is too dangerous. And we need just trust the government. Trust the government to erode some of your rights, to take some of your rights away. In exchange, you'll be safer at the end of it. And that's just a fundamentally ignorant way of thinking, because it will not end up the way you want it to. It's going to make things much worse. So at the end of the day, how do we solve this problem? If gun control or increasing the amount of guns doesn't solve the underlying problem of mass shootings, of gun violence, of ultimately people being killed, because that's what we're all concerned about here. If neither of those two things actually do much at all at resolving the problem, then what would? What even causes the problem to begin with? Never mind how you solve it. What causes the problem? And gun control advocates will still tell you that it's the guns. You look at the United States, you compare them to other countries in the world, and you could see that the United States has a significantly higher number of mass shootings, of these violent crimes, of murder, of gun violence, than all these other industrialized countries in the world. And that this is a problem that is uniquely American. That because the United States has their unique gun culture and this affinity for firearms, it is actually causing all of these problems. That also assumes that gun culture and the rate of gun ownership is the only thing, the only significant thing that is uniquely American. Let me tell you a few other things that are uniquely American compared to the countries that we've been talking about this whole time. To countries like Japan, like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom. What is one thing that these countries have over us? What is one thing that is not even, that is also unfathomable in these countries compared to the United States, when we're talking about mass shootings and these other types of incidents that are just almost non-existent in these countries? What is something else that is not virtually non-existent in all those countries that I just named compared to the United States? Well, in New Zealand, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in Japan, and even these smaller European countries like Sweden, there is no such thing in these countries as being financially set, of doing the right thing, of doing great, and then all of a sudden you are put in exorbitant medical debt because you got sick and you have no way of paying it off. That is something that is uniquely American. Another thing that is uniquely American compared to these other countries is our culture on abortion. In all of these other countries that we have been comparing the United States to, access to abortion is much easier than in the United States, where you have many states like California and New York, sure, where access to abortion is fairly easy. But on the other hand, you have other parts of the country, like Alabama, which passed one of the most controversial anti-abortion pieces of legislation, where the only instance where you can have an abortion is if the life of the mother is at risk. And any doctor partaking in abortion, of giving a pregnant woman an abortion, can serve up to 99 years in prison. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on the abortion debate. If you're pro-life, you can make the case, if abortion is indeed murder, that the United States is actually safer than all these countries if we have a higher regard for unborn children, if abortion is indeed murder. But if you're pro-choice, then maybe there's something going on here. If you consider why people get abortions in the first place. Now, there is no definitive study that definitively links a higher access to abortion and lower rates of crime. There are some studies that have suggested that. The best example being the Freakonomics book, which had a very controversial study that tried to imply that there was a link between Roe v. Wade, which was the landmark abortion decision in the Supreme Court, and the drop in crime that we saw throughout the 1980s and 90s. There is that, but it's still not a definitive study. But even then, consider the circumstances as to why women decide to get abortions. It's mostly poor, low-income women, and they would end up being single mothers, and they would have a hard time raising that child. They could barely support themselves, never mind support a child. So these are women who are in economically vulnerable situations, who have no means of actually supporting that child. So if the child is born and they grow up, they're going to be living in pretty rough circumstances. They're going to have a really hard time to survive. And you think of all these people that have committed these horrific actions. And of course, there's no way of actually empirically finding an empirical fact in this. Like that yes, that all these people that have committed these crimes asked their mother if they wish they got an abortion, or if they tried to get an abortion and couldn't get one. You know, you can't, like, it's hard to definitively say that this is true or this is not true. But you think about it for a second. Why people commit crime, or what leads people into a life of crime? And for the most part, it's circumstantial. It's people's life circumstances. You think of the people who have committed a lot of these horrific actions. You think of the people who have who kill other people. Most of them have grown up in low income, low opportunity areas where you can't get a traditional 9-to-5 job and make good income to support yourself. What leads people to a life of crime is they feel they have no other way but to commit these crimes. So when you have lower access to abortion, a case could be made that if we are in the pro-choice, if we are of a pro-choice mind here, that if we increased access to abortion and expanded it across all 50 states, then maybe we would start to see a significant reduction in crime. Because people being born into these financially, between these vulnerable situations, that would go down. So that is one thing that's uniquely American, is our abortion policy. And there are so many things that the United States has that does not exist in other countries, including healthcare, including abortion access, things that are kind of unfathomable in these other countries that we've been talking about this whole time. I mean, literally every other country that we mentioned, they have a universal healthcare program. They have they have easy access to abortion relative to the United States, at least. And abortion culture is just so different in these countries than it is in America. But most of all, what sets America apart from the rest of the world, and we're not even talking about the industrialized world, we're talking about the entire world here. Talk about how the United States has a significantly higher rate of gun ownership compared to any other country in the entire world. But what is one thing that the United States has a significantly higher rate of than any other country in the world as well? We're talking about incarceration here, okay? Never mind the industrial world. Even when we're talking about these third world countries, when we're talking about these oppressive regimes, when we're talking about countries like Russia and China that arrest their political opponents, that place certain groups of people into re-education camps, that even when we compare ourselves to those countries, the United States has a significantly higher rate of incarceration than any other country in the entire world. Never mind the industrial world, the entire world. So, what was the conversation that we've been having the past few minutes about crime, and about crime ultimately being something that is caused, what motivates people to commit crime is their life circumstances. These are people who have grown up in broken homes, who may not have had, who have grown up with a single mother who was maybe not even able to support them in the ways that they wanted to. So they turn to drugs, they turn to illegal activity because they literally are starving and can't survive. What are the cities that we just mentioned before? At the very beginning, we were talking about how when we were talking earlier about there being no correlation between gun laws and crime, and how there really is nothing in common that St. Louis, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland, and Detroit, Chicago, Memphis, New Orleans. Those were the 6 cities that we talked about early on. We determined that there was nothing in common that they all had that put them on that list of the deadliest cities in the country. When it came to guns, there was no common denominator. But what is one thing that all those cities do have in common? All those cities are in areas with low economic opportunities, with very little opportunity, with high levels of poverty, with a high percentage of African Americans living in those cities, where our justice system has failed, though that community specifically. When you look at our war on drugs, when you look at the fact that even though white people and black people actually consume illegal substances at the same rate, African Americans are being arrested at a disproportionately higher rate than white people. And this has been going on since the beginning of our mass incarceration system. The very beginning of the prison industrial complex happened following emancipation of black slaves. Interestingly, the most comprehensive gun control law also happened around that same time. As part of the Black Codes in the South, laws that were meant at restricting African Americans' rights, even though through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they were specifically guaranteed equal protections under the law after their emancipation. Black codes were still passed that restricted African Americans' rights. The most notable being the poll tax, and when it comes to education, and eventually segregation. But another thing that was part of the Black Codes was that African Americans in the South were not allowed to purchase or own any firearms. Now, why would that be? It's not that people actually thought that black people were dangerous. What are we going to do with these slaves being loose? Because there were plenty of freed men in the North that were not criminals. But there was heavy resistance against black people having equal rights in the South. So what ended up happening was that they retaliated. They lynched innocent black people, falsely accused them of crimes they didn't commit, took away their due process, burned their places of worship down, their churches, their businesses, their homes. And what do you do first? You make sure that they cannot defend themselves. You take away their constitutional right to keep and bear arms. So that was one aspect of it. But what was the very beginning of the prison industrial complex? It was a way to maintain slavery following the emancipation of slaves. People in the South were realizing, oh shit, our entire economy is going to collapse because we literally rely upon slave labor. So how are we going to maintain our lifestyle when we lost the Civil War and now black people are supposed to be guaranteed equal rights? Well, enter the prison industrial complex. All of a sudden, following emancipation, following the Black Codes, following all that, the incarceration rate in the South skyrockets. It skyrockets. So, what does this mean? What does this have to do with the discussion at hand? People are starting to get lost here. Well, there's a point to all this. We were talking about cities like St. Louis, Missouri, cities like Chicago and Detroit and Baltimore. These are cities with a strong African American community that still feel the effects of institutionalized racism. And they still do today. You look at the justice system, you look at the war on drugs that's still going on today, the mass incarceration of African Americans that's still going on today. People's family members, their fathers, their brothers, are being thrown in jail. And it's destroying the black family. So yes, there is a higher rate of crime in these cities where there is a high percentage of African American citizens. And on the surface, someone can make some type of white supremacist argument that black people are inherently more violent than white people and they're criminals and they're not civilized or whatever. But like the gun debate that we've been talking about this entire time, people lack the context. Context matters. And we talked about that with guns. We talked about context mattering when it came to the circumstances behind what causes crime. And that's the underlying theme that I'm trying to get at through this entire video. So, how do we solve crime? How do we significantly reduce violent crime and murder? We do the best we can to improve people's lives, to alleviate the circumstances that lead people to commit these crimes in the first place. And it's not easy. It's not easy, but it's the only way that we can actually have a chance at actually making a difference. Feeling safe and being safe are two completely different things. Okay? Gun control does absolutely nothing to solve or significantly reduce the underlying problem here. The causes, the circumstances that lead to violent crime, to murder, to these heinous crimes. And we need to have a deeper discussion about this. As long as I've been talking to you guys today, over an hour of discussions, that still doesn't do this entire issue justice. And I don't pretend that I have all the answers, that I am an all-knowing God that can solve everybody's problems. But if we truly want to have an honest discussion about this issue, then we need to have it. But when you rely too much on your emotions and how you feel, and on feeling safe, instead of actually making communities safer in meaningful ways and implementing policies that create meaningful change in people's lives, you can take away guns. You can even put more guns out in the street. That's not going to change people's behavior. We need to actually solve the problem here. Because the discussion we're having right now is just a never-ending cycle. It's a never-ending cycle. And we seem too focused on these mass shootings, right? Which are terrible. But they only account for roughly 1% of all homicides in this country. So you're not even addressing the underlying problem of gun violence, of murder. You're only even focusing on a small, tiny percentage of the actual murders that are going on in this country. You're not doing a damn thing to actually solve the problem. You're advocating for policies that will actually exacerbate the problem of mass incarceration and criminalizing people who aren't even necessarily dangers to society. Do you honestly think that many of these non-violent drug offenders are dangerous to society and should spend decades in prison? And we're going to explore the war on drugs in a separate video, because it's important to talk about. And although positive change has been implemented lately with criminal justice reform, we still have a long way to go. We have a long way to go. And there are plenty of other things we can also look at when it comes to abortion, when it comes to health care, when it comes to these things that cripple families, that financially ruin families. So when people are financially ruined and have no means of supporting themselves, they're literally in survival mode. And some people are going to do whatever it takes to survive, because that's in our instincts. So, how do we solve it? Well, there are many different things that we can do. And even after we do all those things, we might not completely solve the problem. But it's going to do a whole lot more than thoughts and prayers or stripping away people's constitutional rights. Those things are not going to do anything at all. And in some cases, it's just going to make things even worse. So, I want there to one day be a meaningful discussion when it comes to gun violence, when it comes to murder in this country, when it comes to violent crime in the United States. But so far, we're not having it. Neither the left nor the right is willing to have an honest discussion about the underlying causes that lead to people committing these heinous crimes. And I understand it's easy to dehumanize people who commit evil. But unless you understand what circumstances led to that person becoming evil, then you're really not doing a damn thing at resolving the issue at hand. Because any one of us could be in that position. Any one of us could be desperate. Could be just living day by day and just not knowing where their next meal is going to come, not knowing what they're going to do if they incur massive amounts of medical debt, and they're going to have to find some way to make ends meet. So we need to have bigger, deeper discussions about this, and even after I tried to have a deeper discussion and a more meaningful discussion than you actually typically hear, I alone am still not doing this issue enough justice. Again, I don't have the solutions to all the problems, but at least I'm trying. I can't say that for most people.